Hello, everyone. I'm Jan Barris, Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. And I'm really happy to welcome today's audience, which includes about 150 people who represent an interesting range, some of whom were in China or about to be in China almost at the same time as today's guests, although not exactly, because as he points out in his book, it was a very, very special, limited time that he was there. And others who came to China at different points during their lives or their careers, spanning from almost 50 years ago to today. And I'm particularly pleased to be moderating this event for a few reasons. The most important being that Paul Pickowicz, the author of this wonderful book, A Sensational Encounter with High Socialist China, which is a very clever name. In addition to, Paul and I were both living in Hong Kong at the same time that this book or the events of this book came about. I was a very lowly, probably the youngest official at the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong. And Paul was across the harbor, living there and working at the wonderful University Services Center, which I hope he'll talk about as part of his discussion this afternoon. If not, I'm going to ask him to talk about that. So we lived there at the same time. And so that's one of the reasons. The second reason is that I know several of the people, in addition to Paul, who were on that trip. And in fact, one of them, Susan Shirk, was my roommate for the 5 months preceding that trip. Unfortunately, the fates decreed that my two-year tour of duty at the U.S. consulate was over on June 1st, 1971. Just about a week or so before Paul and his group left for China. I was really upset. First of all, I was very jealous. Everybody, all of the Americans in China were really jealous of these folks who were getting the chance to go into China, which we used to go up to the border and stare over, but the thought that we could actually get in was a really, really big deal. So I was very jealous, and I was really sorry that I wouldn't be there when Susan came back so that I could get all of her firsthand impressions of what it had been like. So now I'm getting those impressions through Paul and through this great book that he's done. The format's going to be, Paul's going to talk a little bit about the event, how it happened, why it happened, and then take us through some of the wonderful pictures that fill the book and are very, very evocative for anyone who was in China during that period. And then we will go to the Q&A. I'll start with a few questions and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We're very much looking forward to it, and I'm not going to introduce Paul. You all have his bio, but it's very clear when you look at this book, when you see how much time and effort went into not only the selection of the materials, but the conceit that Paul uses to write this memoir in a very interesting way. It's not like your usual memoirs of people's lives, but he does this all very creatively. And it's very clear that he is in the visual arts just by the look and the feel of this wonderful book. So Paul, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful to the committee for inviting me, and especially to Jan and Margot and Steve and Clorinda, the team that has helped to put the whole event together. Actually, Clorinda was a student of mine at Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University just 2 years ago. I know Joan Kaufman is listening in, and she'll appreciate those connections that keep on happening. And I want to thank everybody who is taking part. I guess over 150 people have signed up for the event. Given everything that's going on, I'm delighted that people have found the time to listen in. We've got the pandemic, we've got the Hong Kong situation, we've got Taiwan, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got India border issues, Xinjiang. I mean, it goes on and on and on. I read the New York Times this morning, and it's clear that, you know, Sino-American relations are highly problematic, and we need the committee more than ever. The committee does great work, and I know everybody realizes that, but we need it more than ever. And I want to thank former PhD students of mine, because I got a quick look at the list of people who are participating today. I may not have the most recent version, but a large number of my former PhD students, people mentored by Joe Esherick and me, are sitting in. So I want to say hello to everybody. We were going to have a reunion at AAS in Boston last spring, but guess what? That was canceled. And I want to thank so many old friends whose names I noticed quickly yesterday on the list. People who've contributed so much over the years. Joe Esherick, of course, being one of them. Chuck Hayford's name was on there. Andy Nathan, amazing contributions. Tony Kane, an old friend. I think I saw Bill Speidel's name on there. These are people who really launched exchange programs between the U.S. and China. Tom Gold's name was on there, and on and on and on. It's just wonderful to be back in touch, even if it's virtually. And says the book is called A Sensational Encounter with High Socialist China. So I want to say a few words about how this book came about, and then I want to show some pictures, and then we'll get into the discussion. I think it was 2015, I donated the entirety of my photo collection from that trip to China in 1971 to the UC San Diego Library. And the library went ahead and made a big deal of it. They digitized all the pictures, literally thousands of them. And you can get access to those pictures by just going online. That was back in 2015. I was happy to make that donation. In 2018, I attended an international conference on the 5 senses in Chinese history. And it got me thinking about the possible use of that kind of paradigm, thinking of the 5 senses and our experiences in China as visitors, as researchers, as people who live there. Then in 2019, the City University Press in Hong Kong, speaking of Hong Kong, contacted the UC San Diego's incredible Chinese studies librarian, Chen Xi, to ask whether I would like to write a book on the 1971 visit. A book that would use lots of photographs from that collection. It ended up being 150 photographs, and we're going to see some of them today, but nothing like the 150 from that particular collection. They had seen the digitized images, and they wanted to do something. So I credit them with that. I said, okay, and went back to my diary, which I still have from that period. I kept a day-to-day diary during that trip, June, July, 1971. And I went back through the images to take a closer look. I'm not a great fan of the autobiographical and memoir genres. I wanted to do something different. And call it a reflection on something that happened 50 years ago. That's half a century, folks. I don't like to think of myself in that category. I was 24 years old at the time, and a half a century has gone by. And I wanted to reflect back on that using my diaries, using these images. And I decided at the outset to absolutely 100% reject the strict chronological approach. The sort of approach is, I went to Guangzhou, then I went to Shanghai, then I went to Suzhou, then I went to Nanjing. Boring, you know, who wants to read anything like this is not organized chronologically. So let me tell you how it is organized in conceptual terms. Conceptually, the book is organized in 4 different ways, 4 ways that interface with each other. The 5 main chapters are about the 5 senses. What did 1971 China sound like? What did it taste like? What did it look like? What did it smell like? I have a great chapter there on smell. What did it feel like to the touch, the tactile dimension? These were ideas. Now, I don't want to do any spoilers. I don't want to tell you. In each chapter, I mention a number of examples, and then I come up with, well, let me tell you the big experience on taste, the big one on smell, the big one on sound. I'm not going to do that. I don't want to spoil it. But through the chapters, I go through the five senses and reveal visual and written data that touch on. I thought it was been an interesting way to reflect on that China that existed in the middle of the Cultural Revolution back in 1971. The second conceptual category I use, I define the political moment in China in summer 1971 as high socialism. And of course, that begs the question, what do you mean by high socialism? By that, I mean very, very specifically the period that started with the Ninth Party Congress in April 1969 and continued on. We were there in the summer of 1971. It was a time when Chinese leaders identified China as the most progressive socialist revolutionary force in world history. This was a major claim. This was a major claim. So I've given it the name high socialism. After we left China in July, 81 days after my group left China, that high socialist moment crashed and burned with the death of Lin Biao in what was claimed to be an attempted assassination of Mao Zedong, and then his death in an air crash. That was in September 1971. So I'm calling high socialism that moment, April 1969 to September 1971. But of course, while we were there in June and July, we had no hint that something like the whole Lin Biao incident was going to occur. I spent 4 hours, as a group, we spent 4 hours with Jiang Chunqiao and Yao Wenyuan, along with Zhou Enlai. Who could have known at that point that those people, that Jiang Chunqiao and Yao Wenyuan, would be arrested and thrown in prison in subsequent years. So it's looking at that, freezing that moment from in summer 71 in what I'm calling the high socialist period from April 1969 to September 1971. The third framework that I use, I also conceptualized the book in theatrical terms, in terms of 3 performances that were going on every single day. So I have a lot of theatrical language in there as well. The 3 performances were the larger Cultural Revolution performance that was going on 24/7 throughout China while we were there. It was going on anyway, whether we were there or not. This is what I call the larger Cultural Revolution performance. The second performance I talk about is the smaller performance put on for us, put on for our delegation, our group, in an effort put on for us as we visited through model units. So we went through all sorts of cities, villages, rural places, urban spaces, and invariably when we got to all these locations, all of them were model units of this high socialist moment, and we witnessed performances put on for our benefit. These are smaller performances within that larger performance of the Cultural Revolution. And then the third one is what I call our own amateurish performances, done in an effort to foster friendship, improve U.S. China relations, and promote opening, given the fact that we were there so early. So singing, dancing, we did all of the above in all the places that we visited. So finally, the last framework that's used in the book, it also frames the 1971 visit in terms of the absolutely central importance of Hong Kong in the run-up to the trip and in the aftermath of the trip. And the City U Press asked me specifically to do this. They said, you've got the 5 chapters on the 5 senses and the high socialism and the performances and so forth, but would you talk more about what happened in Hong Kong in the months running up to how this trip happened? And I make the claim in the book that this was the first visit to the People's Republic of China by university-based China scholars since 1949. So how did this actually happen in the Hong Kong setting? And then once we left China, of course, during our visit, Henry Kissinger made his secret visit to China, and then the news was suddenly popped out. Nixon is coming to China in spring '72. And so as soon as we crossed the border, the international press was just absolutely dying to talk with us about our experiences, given that China was now on the front pages owing to the Kissinger visit. Okay, so let me just run you very, very quickly through just, I think, 26 pictures. With Steve's help, we're going to go through these, and I'm just going to say a few words about each picture. This is the group. Here we are in Hong Kong. That's my calligraphy down below. 祝美人民友好万岁. So there we are. I'm on the upper left. I know you can see that right away. Pretty obvious. Susan Shirk is down there in the lower right. We had a very diverse group. There was a veteran from U.S. military service. There were 2 Protestant missionaries, and so on and so forth. So it was a great group. But we met in Hong Kong. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in terms of the 5 senses, some images will be useful about the tactile dimension, this idea of participating in hard labor without the benefit of machines, development, socialist development, cannot wait for machines, we're going to have to do it all by labor. So this kind of scene would look, I think, odd to young people in big cities in China today, but there we are. Same kind of thing. If you're going to build buildings, don't wait for the machines. Let's just carry it up there and use physical labor. So we heard this theme of, the need for everybody to participate in hard physical labor. We heard this almost every day. Here's an intellectual, for example, a professor from Beijing University. What's he doing? We visited a May 7th cadre school, which all the intellectuals, professors from the universities had to go to participate in labor. So this is a professor from Beijing University making pails at a May 7th cadre school. So this was pretty interesting. Here's that same message, very tactile, hands-on. So I decided I can do that too. Give me a hoe and I'll go out into the field. And we were very eager to participate in labor. That was the tactile dimension of showing that even as students and graduate students and budding intellectuals, we were capable of doing this. You can see the officials there look a little bit nervous about the young American with the hoe, but anyway, it wasn't going to stop me. People were extremely curious. This picture is interesting because of the way people are dressed, especially the way women are dressed with their buttons buttoned right up to the top. Little girl, intensely curious. This is at the Great Wall of China, and these are local tourists, but the look is very, very typical. You don't see anybody, even with a wristwatch. That would have been something highly desirable. Some people had them, a lot of people didn't. Going through villages, all sorts of unexpected things happened. We're getting off a bus. A bunch of kids ran out from the village to say hi. Who could have thought? None of them, they don't even have shoes. They're not even wearing shoes. They all have Mao badges, but they don't have shoes. But they're clapping and wondering, who are these visitors coming into our village? We visited a hospital, and the theme, the book goes into great detail on this, but all the units are run by revolutionary committees. The revolutionary committees are dominated by the military, and that's one of the characteristics of the high socialist moment. The military is in charge of the revolutionary committees, and they greet us, and this was to see surgery. We put on surgical gowns and we stood beside physicians, the surgeons, as they did surgery. We witnessed, I think, 4 surgeries altogether. And the only means of anesthesia, we were told, was acupuncture. And the patients, therefore, were awake during the procedure. So here we are visiting the hospital in Beijing. Here we are. This woman was having an ovarian cyst removed. It turned out to be that I watched that. So this is part of the visual, part of the tactile, standing there, knowing nothing about medicine and watching this woman's abdomen opened and a big ovarian cyst taken out and shown to us, and she was awake during the whole thing. This is interesting because it shows, in the urban sector at least, a diversity in the way that kids dressed. The young girls, you see them very colorfully dressed in a park, happen to bump into them. They have these supersized Mao badges, at least a couple of them. But again, this would have been cutting edge urban young kids and the way they looked at about this time. This was, again, I write extensively about this. We got to visit a militia unit, People's Militia Unit in Nanjing, and spent quite a bit of time there, write about it extensively in the book. And you see kids 10, 11, 12 years old in these units learning how to use all sorts of weaponry. Here you see them, some of the youngsters, young teens with their, it says in Chinese, the red banners say Little Red Guard. With the Mao badges and learning how to, because just shortly before this, there was a border war between the Soviet Union and China. And there was a lot of talk in this high socialist period of, anything could happen. We have to prepare everybody, including the kids, for armed conflict, including the nicely dressed young primary school students. Again, holding the Mao book, which is functioning as virtually as a religious text, during this period, and holding the weapons. And in terms of the Mao Cult was, of course, everywhere. Everywhere we went, this was part of the visual aspect of traveling around China. This is in Shanghai at the Shanghai Industrial Exhibit. I don't recall if that statue is still up. It may or may not be. Some of them are come down. Jan is shaking her head. It's down now, yeah. But this is the kind of thing one saw everywhere. And again, going to schools, it almost felt like going to a church, a very fundamentalist kind of church. There's the Bible. The kids have their arms folded in exactly the same way. Very attentive. The girls seated, in one place, the boys seated in another place. This was a school, a primary school we visited. We visited all sorts of schools. Here's back to the hospital. So this fellow is having surgery done, again, using acupuncture as the only means of anesthesia. But what's fantastic, not only in tactile terms about what he's going through, but that he has the sacred text, inches from his head. I remember in one of the cases when the surgery was over, the first thing said by some people in another culture might thank God, after a surgery like this, and others would thank Chairman Mao and having held that sacred book so close. This is another school, Revolutionary Committee, once again dominated by the military. Which is what was characteristic of this high socialist era, with Lin Biao chosen as Mao's closest comrade in arms and successor. Here, acupuncture is being used on deaf-mute children in a deaf-mute school. It was in Guangzhou. And again, you see they've got the sacred book nearby. Even in terms of art, the visual parts, you're visiting art academies and so forth. And the theme very much was China is the leader of the world international socialist revolutionary movement, especially the third world, the Yafela, the Asia, Africa, Latin America. And here's an oil painter doing a realistic, using the actual model of the gun of a Vietnamese, Viet Cong fighter during the Vietnam War. This is a better one in the sense that it's a huge mural, and it basically is saying, again, China is the leader of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Forget about the Soviet Union. They're revisionists, and it shows, get the U.S. aggressors, get them out of, Asia, and China will lead this struggle. This is in Suzhou, a beautiful imperial era complex, and then this poster, it's actually painted onto the wall, quite remarkable visually. We actually did what we called it people's diplomacy. That is to say, when we were in Beijing, we made a request to visit with Prince Norodom Sihanouk, who was in exile. The government in power in Cambodia at the time was an ally of the United States, and Prince Sihanouk was in Beijing. We went to see him. This is long before the Khmer Rouge come to power, and I'll never forget a comment he made. He referred to the Khmer Rouge as his little red Buddhists. That got a nice chuckle from it, but he served us French hors d'oeuvres and so forth. Quite a remarkable, that's me in the back, by the way. We met Zhou Enlai, as I said, for 4 hours one night, and we could spend hours just talking about that. I talk about it in the book at length. Some interesting and surprising things happened during that 4-hour meeting, but it was from 8 o'clock at night until midnight. And Yao Wenyuan and Zhang Chunqiao, two of the people later identified as members of the Gang of Four, were also there for the whole 4-hour period. And it was quite remarkable, but I think Jan may have some questions about that. Yeah, he said that night that, he said, tomorrow morning, July 19th, 1971, your photograph will appear in People's Daily. And sure enough, it did. This is the next day's People's Daily. There's Joe in the middle. There's Zhang Chunqiao to the left, Yao Wenyuan to the right. I'm there behind Joe. And then there are a bunch of people I could identify way over to the left, Zhou Peiyuan, who had become a physicist who was the president of Beijing University when it reopened as a worker, peasant, soldier university. And there are lots of other notable figures there. One of my jobs was to make some final remarks that evening and to pin, we had a little button from our group with a peace symbol on it, and in Chinese, long live the friendship between the Chinese and American people. And one of us was to pin it onto Zhou Enlai. And I have to admit, he looks extremely nervous about the pinning. And you can see Zhang Chunqiao over to the right there. He also looks really, really nervous. Am I going to stick the pin into his chest? Okay, next picture. Suddenly, everybody's relaxed. There's the pin. It worked. he wasn't hurt. He got a smile. I gave him a photograph of the group and so forth. And so my feeling about this kind of, when I went to Hong Kong in 1970, exactly 50 years ago, virtually today, went off to Hong Kong for this adventure that ended up with this time in China. Life is interesting. Things come along. It's unplanned. It's unscripted. And so sometimes when things come along, what you do is you just jump into the water. So let's see the final slide. That's me. That's not the final slide. This is the press conference at Hong Kong and the Foreign Correspondents Club. On the way out, international press met with us, and I guess I might have said something along those lines. Wow, we were there, and we had an opportunity to jump into the water, and so we just jumped into the water. There we go. There we go. That's me in Nanjing, jumping into the water and seeing what China was like in the middle of 1971. So I hope I kept under our time limit, but we're going to go back over to Jan.
So thank you for keeping within the time limits, and thank you for picking out some of those pictures. And I would encourage those of you who are history buffs or who either were in China during that time and want to, or very soon thereafter, and want to bring back some wonderful memories, to take a look. The photos for people who weren't professional photographers, you got some very good photographs. So thank you for sharing them with all of us. I just have a few questions or themes I want to pursue with you a little bit more. You talked about at one point the importance of Hong Kong, but I wonder if you can go into that a little more, because I don't think people who have came to the study of China after 1979 or in the 80s or 90s understand how very difficult it was to be studying a culture, studying a people, a nation, a country, an ideology of whatever, without ever being able to step foot into that country. And the very important role that Hong Kong played at that time, vis-a-vis China watching, both for the academic community and for others, if you want to talk about that. How that's changed over the years. You have visited Hong Kong over the past 5 decades, and what the current situation in Hong Kong is going to mean. I'm not talking about big geopolitical issues now. I'm talking about Hong Kong as a place where people went to better understand China and do it in a way where they had free access to archives, to libraries, and to the ability to speak about the issues that were going on in a free and open academic manner that we're used to. So if you could talk about those, the period before, in the middle, and now toward the future.
Okay, let me go ahead, and that's big question, lots of dimensions. But for the younger people in the audience, you cannot imagine graduate students like us at the time thinking we were going to be devoting our life to the study of China with absolutely no opportunity to ever go there. I had mentors, most of us had mentors who had never been in China, and yet we're studying the place. So how'd you like to study Germany and never have a chance to go there? How would you like to study Australia and never have a chance to go there? And that was what we were looking at. And I wasn't even a scholar of contemporary China. My dissertation work was on the 1920s and 30s, Republican period. But in those days, as graduate students, you had three options. You can stay in the US and work the libraries. You can go to Taiwan. Many people went to Taiwan and spent a year doing dissertation research there, or you could go to Hong Kong. I chose Hong Kong because of the nature of my subject. I was doing, revolutionary literary debates in the 1920s and 30s, and I was going to find a lot more sources in Hong Kong through the University Service Center and so forth. And so most of the people who were interested in the revolution or in contemporary China took the Hong Kong option and went to Hong Kong for a year. And you're right. I mean, you're that close, but the frustration of being that close, even if you weren't a scholar of present day China, but hey, I still want to be there. I want to go. That's the tactile dimension. I want to set foot on Chinese soil, and I want to meet people there and shake their hands. So that was frustrating. There were bus tours that took tourists up to a cliff overlooking red China. You could look into the distance and see red China. It was crazy. So Hong Kong was incredibly important. Not to say we didn't have this burning desire. I think all young people in the China field wanted to find a way to get to China and figure out a way to do research there. It took a long time before that was possible. In my case, not until the late 1970s. But meanwhile, Hong Kong continued to be an incredibly important a place, not just for archives, but what began to happen as early as the late 60s, early 70s, and on through the 70s, is that you got refugees coming from China. People literally would jump in the water and swim over to Hong Kong. And so lots of scholars were looking for opportunities. They were so eager to talk to somebody who had had personal experience in China that they would interview people in Hong Kong. That was an extremely important thing. And then there were representatives of the PRC press there. There were 3 or 4 newspapers that were, so you could be reading papers that were really being controlled by Beijing. You could read the Hong Kong papers with different perspectives. So it was an extremely exciting place to be. And so for grad students now who just assume, I think all of the grad students Joe Escherick and I mentored, 34, 35 grad students, they all went to China. That was just normal. You get a ticket, you get on a plane, you go to China, and you keep on going back. So I think there was a lessening of the importance of Hong Kong as a research center for scholars. Although I think it never stopped. There were always people who went there. And I think to this day, the University Service Center has relocated. But to this day, the University Service Center, I know some of my grad students have been there to use the materials they have. So I continue to believe that Hong Kong is a really important place to do research. One can only hope that the current things that are going on in Hong Kong with respect to censorship and political tightness are not going to make it more difficult to do research related to either Hong Kong or China, PRC history or earlier periods in Hong Kong. I was there as recently as last, October. I was there in the early part of October in the middle of the demonstrations and everything. And I met up with a lot of my former students and old friends, including journalist friends. Mike Chenoy lives there now, and we got caught up. So I think there's a lot of worry. There's a lot of worry about what Hong Kong is going to be like, going on into the future. But for us, it was just this wonderland of here I am in Asia. It was my first trip to Asia. On the way over, I stopped briefly in Japan and Taiwan, but it was my first trip to Asia as a 24-year-old. And it was a fantastic experience, and I could never have known that various things would happen coincidentally that would allow us to actually make a trip to China. And then I've been visiting China, ever since, on up to the present. So, 3 cheers for Hong Kong, and also people I think still, need to get access directly to China and interact with people there to do their research.
Okay, I have been neglectful as a moderator. So first of all, thank you for that answer, but I have been neglectful as a moderator and not told those who haven't been on a national committee public program before that if you would like to ask a question, you should go to the Q&A icon that's at the bottom of your screen and just type in a question. We will try to get to it. I might lump 2 or 3 questions in together. And in fact, 2 have just come in that I'm going to do that with. But first, well, let me get to those first before my own questions. One of these sort of mirrors my own question, and that is, you met a lot of people along the way, from Zhou Enlai down to people on the street, people in parks. You had a lot of conversations with these people. The question is, and you also, I know the makeup of your group was such that many of you had very different levels of belief in the system that you were looking at. So one of the major overall questions I had was how did you get along as a group with those different political beliefs represented amongst all of you? Have you stayed together as a group? Do you have reunions, etc.? So let me ask you that first part of it, and then I'll get to the second part, which also includes questions from others.
So yes, I mean, we met, we were all at the University Service Center on Argyle Street in Hong Kong in those days. We met there, we bonded. It's true, people came from different universities, they had different backgrounds. Some people were studying present day China, which means mid-cultural revolution China. Some of us were studying earlier periods, different disciplines, looking at different kinds of materials, but we got along. We're all roughly in the same age group. And we got along very well. We had lunch there, every day we talked, and we all fantasized about, wouldn't it be great to be able to go to China someday? How can we spend our lives as some of our mentors did in the field and never actually get to the place? But it's true, the group was very diverse in terms of, so as I mentioned before, Tony Garaventi, he was a military veteran, had been in the army. There were 2 Protestant missionaries, Ray and Rhea Whitehead were Protestant missionaries, and so forth. Susan, went on and she worked for the State Department, later in her career. We had a tremendous spectrum. I think probably the 2 things that there was broad agreement on politically were opposition to the war in Vietnam. I mean, most of us had been active in one way or another protesting against the war in Vietnam, which was really at its peak then. I mean, I remember in high school, because I went to college and so forth, I didn't get drafted. I had, teenagers I played football with in high school who were drafted and died in Vietnam. I didn't even know where Vietnam was as a high school student and why we were there and so forth. So there was a great deal of interest in the Vietnam War and opposition to it that I think we shared. The other big issue that we shared was what in those days was called women's lib. So there wasn't a person in the group who wasn't, gung-ho on women's lib. And we made a big fuss about that in China during the trip because they were claiming everywhere we went that there was, Nandu Pingdang, men and women are equal. And we just kept on seeing evidence time and again that that wasn't necessarily, the case. And we brought it up and so forth. And I talk about that in the book as well. So there were a spectrum of views, we kept, I think, in quite close contact in the years immediately following, because a number of us went on national speaking tours when we got back to the U.S. because there was so much interest in China. Nixon's going to China. Nobody knows anything about China. Anyone who'd been there had instant credibility, and so traveled around speaking and staying in touch. And I think people, I think there was among some in the group, there was this sense of not just curiosity, but hope that something good was happening in China, politically, socially, and so forth. And this is where the theatricality comes in. You go to all these model units and you hear all the model stories about how everything is unfolding so wonderfully. And I think at one level, people who in the ping pong team that went to China before we did, the same kind of thing happened. Many people, I think, wanted, hoping that something good was going to happen. Now, many got disabused of that right away, even during the trip, but after the trip, to see that there were clear gaps and contradictions. And I talk about some of those in the book. But some of the people in the group who were studying contemporary China and had interviewed and talked with refugees from China and Hong Kong, knew that this theatrical performance that we were both witnessing and participating in, was certainly not the whole story. To fast forward many years, just by coincidence, so Susan's a good example. Susan ended up at UC San Diego, and so we've been colleagues, for multiple decades. And then people on the West Coast, I think, have seen each other. Once in a while, I'll go to and give a talk somewhere in the U.S., and somebody will show up in the audience and come up afterwards. Oh, it was one of the people, who was on the trip. Most went into academia, but some didn't. No, I don't think we ever had anything as such as a reunion. But keeping in correspondence, certainly, especially the first 3 or 4 years after that initial visit.
Well, speaking of the theatricality that you talked about, that several questions have come in along the lines of how much did you believe of what you were being told? How much did you believe the people who were telling you what they were telling you believed it? Emil Chi, who is actually Ji Chaoju's son, I hope I have that right, son or nephew. I apologize, Emil, I should know that. And Ji Chaoju was Mao's interpreter for many, many years, the man who stood next to Mao. And in fact, he's in one of your pictures, but you've misidentified him, so I have to tell you about that. But anyway, Emil says that he was in China with his family at the same time. They saw the same acupuncture types of operations that you saw. But he says it was all a fake, because before the people went in for the operation and into the operating room, the patient had received injections of procaine. So it wasn't all as it appeared to be. And Tom Gold, your old friend, asked if when you went back in 1978 for your Socialist Village project, were you able to talk with some of the people you met in 1971? And if so, did they tell you the truth that they couldn't say in 71? And I should say along those lines, I remember being at some factory. I have no idea now what kind of factory. It was I think it was a tractor factory back in 73 on my first trip. And then going back 2 or 3 years later, sometime after 78, going to that exact same factory, being briefed by the exact same woman, but the Zhendan Jieshao, that briefing was very different than the briefing we had had in the years before. And I went up to her and said, you're not going to remember me, but I have my notebook that I brought along with me from my first trip, and I can point out the differences in the 2 briefings you just gave us. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, in the old days, this was after reform, the old days, the way to get ahead quickly was to lie to the foreigner, and the person who lied best got promoted the fastest. So, it's easy to say that in retrospect. I'm sure the first time around I believed everything I was told, but how much, at late at night over Mao Tais or over beer, whatever you were drinking, did you guys talk about the reality or unreality of what you'd just seen?
Okay. So Mao Tais were not available. No money. We didn't have the money for it either. So, yeah, I mean, that's the key thing that you said is we're talking about something that happened a half century ago, 50 years ago. It sounds strange to me even to say that. And as I said, some people studied contemporary China, some didn't. Here was this opportunity to go. And I think the main item on the agenda was to try to make what we called, in a utopian kind of way, people-to-people contact. And that's why I worked this theatricality thing into the book, because we did take very seriously, every person in the group, what we were calling people-to-people diplomacy. And so it might be, some high official, but it might be someone on the street, or late at night, not, after dinner, you go out for a walk and you just bump into some random people, and you speak enough Chinese to be able to communicate with them. There's this ongoing agenda of trying to leave a good impression, hoping that, hoping against hope that these two places will be able to get together, on into the future. So I think, as I say in the book, I think we were quite clear that going to all of these model units, I think I say at some point in the book, visiting China in the middle of 1971 was a bit like going on a group tour to North Korea today. And you're going to be taken around to these units, and everything's going well. And it just, and if you don't know that much, you take notes and you think about it, or take the medical stuff. What do I know about medicine? I'm standing there in surgeon's gown, watching somebody being, operated on, and I'm being told that the only means of anesthesia is acupuncture. What am I to think? I just, take the notes down, take the photographs, and so forth. In retrospect, it looks very interesting with the Mao book beside somebody's head. And, this performance aspect of what was going on is what I try to emphasize. And the fact that we were, doing that sort of thing too. Tom's question is a very good one, because I didn't get to go back to China again until 1978. To start this, 77, I went back in 77, but we started this village field research project. Ed Friedman, Mark Selden, and I started a project in 78 in Wugong village. I had not visited that village in 71, so there was no way to go back and actually talk to people I'd spoken to in 71 in villages. But the people in the village in 78 were a lot like the people I had spoken to in villages all around China in 1971. And even in 78, this is the Pierre Hua Guofeng was the new leader, and Gang of Four had been arrested, but a lot of things still felt a lot like the Cultural Revolution. And we had learned so much more about China in the intervening 6-7 years. But even then, it took a tremendous amount of time. We had a lot of interest in publishing a book right away. We had done the first village research, project in the post Nixon visit period, and publishers wanted us, and we waited for years actually, because we had to go back again a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and you actually begin to establish decent relations with certain of the people being interviewed, whether they're in the poor peasant category, middle peasant, rich peasant, landlord, category. You get to the point where they begin to get what it is you're trying to do. And so we'd go over the same questions, and every time you go back, it got better and better and better. And that element, so this is that, I would call it this element of trust, that they understood we were trying to do something serious. And they trusted us. They didn't think we were spies or something, and they no longer felt that compulsion to just say a lot of things that were just a lot of nonsense. But in 1971, I think that would have been way too much to expect. Again, there were ironic things happened. Just one example I'll give that I talk about in the book at length in the taste chapter was going to Dajai, which was the #1 model village in China at the time. The slogan, "Nongye Shi Dajai," this was Mao's #1 model village. Chen Yongui was the leader of the village. We met Chen Yongui in Dajai. We had dinner one night. We broke up into small groups, and I actually was in the group that went and had dinner in Chen Yongui's home. It was a cave. It was basically a cave, and we're sitting there, 2 or 3 of us, along with Chen and a couple of other officials, and the food is being brought out, and I couldn't help but notice that the women were nowhere present, the Chinese women. And I actually asked a question. I talk about it in the book. And I said, "Oh, what about, the women were preparing the food behind the scenes?" And I brought this up as an example of, men and women are equal. Yeah, but what's the explanation for why the women are preparing the food and serving us, and all the men are sitting out here, eating and so forth? And then he replied with some vague response about, well, there are cultural traditions and so forth that are meaningful, in these villages and so forth. So even within the performances, the big performance, the small performances for us, there were contradictions. There were things that didn't quite make sense. And so, we did get some of that, but again, you wouldn't want to exaggerate the extent to which you could get, at that time, under those circumstances, get the kind of picture that ever so slowly, began to come out in subsequent years, especially by the 1980s.
Paul, both you and I have been, I think, mildly chastised by Professor Tom Grunfeld, who points out that it was there's neither one of us mentioned the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, which in fact was the group that was invited to visit. So if you could briefly tell everyone about that committee, but also Tom's question, or Tom's comment raises a question to me, and how much do you think the reason you were invited was because of this organization, the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars, which was a group of American Asian scholars who were very opposed to the Vietnam War, and the Chinese were picking up on that? And how much of it was this personal connection that you made with one of the Chinese journalists who lived in Hong Kong at the time, and with whom you've made friends?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great question. In some ways, the short answer is all of the above. CCAS stood for Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. And if my memory serves me, it was launched in 1969. I had just started my PhD program at the University of Wisconsin. And I think it was set up, it was mainly graduate students and junior faculty who studied Asia. So that wasn't just China. There were people who studied Japan, Korea, India, and so forth. And I think initially the younger faculty members who launched it saw it as an alternative to the establishment organization of the Association for Asian Studies. Association for Asian Studies, I think the feeling among young people was, should have been saying more by way of critique about the war in Vietnam. But again, I think the young people who got involved in CCAS, again, spectrum of political views all over the map, and then issues like women's lib and so forth were also part of that. I had 1969, just at about the time I went to that conference in Boston, there was a Black student movement at the University of Wisconsin that I just recently went through all my memorabilia about that movement in 1969, which was so, going through all the documents, it reminded me so much of what's going on today. It's still going on today. And so these are young people who are concerned about a range of social issues, women's lib, Black lives, racism, so on and so forth, also about war and the opposition to the war. Professionals should be doing more to speak out, against the war. And so I think that more or less explains the origin of it. And then at different universities, there were different chapters of the organization. Again, very diverse. When we got to Hong Kong, some of the people who ended up going on the trip had been active to a more or less degree on their home campus. Others hadn't been active at all and not even belonged. But it turned out that we thought that might make sense. I did make personal contact with someone in China, a publisher, who I talk about at length in the book, who got very interested in us as young people. And we decided ultimately we would put ourselves forward. We didn't run it by anybody or check it with anyone. We just put ourselves forward as the Hong Kong chapter of this group. And we were intensely interested in visiting China. We wanted to promote, people-to-people relations and, better U.S.-Sino-American relations, all of that stuff there. That was part of our agenda. I think that is part of the reason. But of course, just before us, the ping pong team had been invited. And after us, there were other groups being invited. So I think another part of the picture is what we don't know at that moment is behind the scenes, the Chinese and American governments are talking secretly. And of course, we all learned this in the middle of our trip when Kissinger shows up secretly and then departs China. Nixon's coming. Okay, that couldn't have been happening unless there were some talks going on well before this. So I guess at about the time that I was trying to represent the group to people in Hong Kong as young people who would love to have the chance to go to China, a very diverse group of young people who really want closer relations between China and the United States. At exactly that time, this is just the luck factor. I think they were looking for people to invite, different kinds of people representing different kinds of groups. And we were, oh, maybe they imagined we were the younger generation of U.S. China scholars. And so, maybe it made sense. And then maybe we were not Cold War minded and open to dialogue and so on and so forth. Again, we were never told that. We just suddenly get the invitation to go, and guess what? We go, and so forth. So I think, it's a great question, but I think all of those factors played into the final, formal invitation to go. And I should remember, I want to mention very quickly in passing, some of this stuff was just so funny because you'll know this, maybe young people today won't realize it, but U.S. passports at that time in 1971, I still have my passport. I still have it, and I talk about it in the book. US passports at that time, it says in them, the passport is not valid for use, and it has a list of places. And the category for China was not valid for use in communist-controlled areas of China, which would have been everything except Taiwan. Yes, so that was pretty funny. Nobody took that very seriously. And of course, again, out of luck, because behind the scenes, relations are beginning to change, secret visits are being made. So this is, I think, the last point at which anybody wants to make a fuss about us going to China anyway, in violation of what was said on the passport. But it was interesting, as we entered China, though, that day, walking across the bridge at Lowu, and when the passports were stamped, they were not stamped in the actual passport. They wouldn't recognize the passport. It was on a separate piece of paper, and it was tucked into the passport. I still have that too. Very, very interesting. All of these minor little details that reflect on a really complicated situation that nobody knew where it was going to go. Nobody could have predicted in the middle of 71 that Lin Biao was going to be dead in a couple of months, that the Jiang Chunxiao and Yuan Jiangqing, all these people were going to be arrested, and that slowed down. In fact, later I'll tell you a Zhou Enlai story about that. But it slowed down the ongoing possibilities of better relations between China and the United States until 78, 79, when things began to warm up again.
Well, alas, you telling us that story about Zhou Enlai is going to have to wait for another meeting with you, because we are quickly running out of time. I really wanted to talk about the Zhou Enlai meeting because when my first visit, we met with him as well, and I have some very interesting memories of that trip, and I would love to, maybe just privately, we can talk about those. There was also a very good question. Professor Madeline Dong wanted to ask a question, but if you can answer it in 1 or 2 sentences. First of all, she says how nice it is to see you, and she's looking forward to reading your book. But her comment is that this visit happened at a time when the US and China barely had any meaningful relationships. Today, US-China relationship seems to be descending into a very dark place. What kind of insights did you glean from your trip and on US-China relations today and in the future?
Okay, this again.
I know it's a long question to answer in 1 minute, but go.
Yes, a very lovely person has asked this question, deserving of a lovely answer. I think there is meaning still today of what is going on, what was happening in 71 and what is happening today. I open the paper every day and I just, oh my God. So a lot of the messiness of what we see now is happening at the state-to-state level. It seems to get messier and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But what I urge everybody to do, and this is something I think I internalized as early as 1971, is keep your people-to-people contacts going. I have tons of friends in China, academics, journalists, all sorts of people, former students, and we need to stay in touch with each other more than ever. And of course, maybe WeChat is going to end pretty soon. But anyway, there are ways for us to communicate by email, by FaceTime. I've been teaching in China the last couple of years and hope to be able to get back there again once the pandemic is over. But it's, again, it may sound trivial and trite, but I don't think it is. I think people at the level below the state need to stay in touch and talk to each other and be honest with each other. And I get enormous rewards from doing that. I come away buoyed up. And including my students from China here in the U.S. It's just precious. They add a dimension that I don't know what we'd do without it. And they're making such a difference in the field once they go out into the field. So that's the takeaway, that idea of let's not think the only realm that exists is the state-to-state realm. There are other realms, and I think we have to keep that very much alive, especially now.
Well, in the light of that wonderful, inspiring last comment, I'm going to go to something a little lighter. We've got two questions about food, and these have to be the last questions. Two questions about food. One is from Ted Enberg, who is a former intern at the National Committee. He wants to know, what was the most Western place to eat or to go to during that time in China, which should be a very easy answer for you. And the second question about food, you just mentioned that the prior question came from a very lovely lady, and I'm sure you'll think this questioner is also a very lovely lady because it's from your daughter, Natasha. And Natasha wants to know, could you please speak a little as to how your experiences with food and cooking informed your observations of this particular period? And before you answer that, I should note for all of our listeners that I've just found out that today is your anniversary. Yes. And that you're not only Natasha, but she and your wife are listening in on this. So we want to wish all three of you a happy anniversary. And now go ahead and answer those two food-related questions.
Okay, well, okay, what a great way to end, actually. The food thing, I mean, frankly, remembering back to 71 and that trip, I don't remember getting access or having access to so-called foreign food, Western food, and that would include Japanese food or Southeast Asian food, anywhere in China. But in terms of Western culture, I actually do have quite a big section on on one of my chapters about ballet. And I talk about the famous model ballet, Red Detachment of Women. I talk about that at length in the book in ways that I think some people will find surprising. And one of them is that ballet, this is one of Mao's wife's, Jiang Qing's model performances, and it's actually Western ballet, nothing Chinese about ballet. And the music was orchestral music that is very Western. And so that was really interesting. It struck me because there was so much emphasis on, Chinese this, Chinese that, Chinese culture, and so forth. And yet this model ballet was, in its own unintended way, that's the way I talk about it, mesmerizing. But no food. I remember in the late 70s, getting there. If you could find a place, there were places that were selling vanilla ice cream at the Beijing Hotel. If you got over there, you could get a scoop of vanilla ice cream. That's 1977, 78. So it took a while for the food to kick in. Natasha, yeah, so she's asked me a question that would take me an hour to answer. But I actually think that this is a huge gap in the China studies field. And whether you're talking about antiquity, middle period, late imperial, modern, contemporary, we need to have much more serious research on the meaning of food and culinary experiences in Chinese culture. And the connections to social, economic, political, all sorts of other cultural issues. It's just food is so central to the culture, and I'm just surprised that not more people have done. I do a little, I have a tiny little bit. I have one chapter on the subject that is, and again, it involves some ironies and things that caught me by surprise in the culinary scene. But there's so much more that needs to be done, and I think it's a great topic. And yeah, it is true. I mean, mean, this was supposed to be a live event in New York today, because long ago we had scheduled a visit for our wedding anniversary to go to New York to see our daughter Natasha, who lives in Greenpoint and is very well known in culinary circles, I should say. And yes, my wife is from China. That's another story altogether, another book. I could call the book "Trying to Get Married in China in 1983." It wasn't easy. But anyway, that's another story, not part of this book. But yeah, it's been 37 years. And I just wish it could have been in New York so we could have a reunion. And the committee, I haven't forgotten this. By the way, Jan, the committee promised us a nice dinner after, after the event was over. So I'm going to
yeah, it's a standing invitation. We look forward to welcoming you and your wife and Natasha to the best Chinese meal we can find in New York for you, because you deserve it. This was a wonderful program. We really appreciate your enthusiasm and your warmth and your openness throughout. I'm sorry to all of those who sent in some really interesting questions. There just isn't enough time in an hour, and we've already gone over by 5 minutes. So my apologies to all of you. I was going to describe some of the upcoming programs we have this week, one on TikTok, one next week on diplomacy, can it avert a new Cold War, and another program that I'm not remembering. So please go to our website. We look forward to seeing you on future programs. And again, Paul, thank you so very much for this. It was wonderful. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.